License and registration?
I'm driving to church, officer. What's the reason for the stop?
This car doesn't match your tax bracket. Where did you really get it?
It's my vehicle, and I'm Federal Judge Martha Higgins. My credentials are right here.
Federal judge? Sure. Step out or I'm cuffing you.
Officer, you've just made the biggest mistake of your life.
The body cam footage captured every second. Every racial slur disguised as casual speech. Every assumption that a 75-year-old black woman in a modest sedan couldn't possibly be who she claimed. What Officer Beckett didn't know was that the grandma he just threw in handcuffs had sentenced 47 murderers to death row, and she was about to add his career to her list of judgments. This traffic stop would cost him his badge, his pension, and $900,000 of taxpayer money. But here's the real question. If you drove past this scene right now, elderly black woman in handcuffs screaming, "She's a judge," while a cop laughs, would you pull over and record? Or keep driving because it's not your business? Be honest. Comment yes or no. Because what happens next proves that bystanders with cameras can destroy careers or save lives. Hit follow if you want to see how this racist cop's world collapsed in 48 hours. 20 minutes earlier, the morning had been peaceful, almost sacred in its quietness. Judge Martha Higgins sat behind the wheel of her 2008 Toyota Camry, her silver hair carefully styled in soft curls that framed her weathered face. At 75 years old, she had developed certain routines that brought her comfort, and Sunday morning drives to First Baptist Church were among her most cherished. She had dressed with her usual care that morning, a navy vest over a crisp white blouse, her late husband's watch still ticking faithfully on her wrist after 43 years. The car itself was nothing special, showing its age with faded paint and a slight rattle in the engine, but it was paid off and reliable, and that was all she needed. The dashboard clock read 9:47 a.m. as she turned onto Maple Avenue, a tree-lined street that connected her modest neighborhood to the church on the other side of town. She drove carefully, perhaps more carefully than most, keeping her speedometer steady at 40 kilometers per hour in a zone marked for 50. Her daughter had been after her for months to get her hearing checked, insisting that she was missing phone calls and turning the television volume up too high. Martha had been putting it off, not wanting to admit that age was catching up with her in yet another way. She had already surrendered her position on the bench after 45 years of service and already accepted that her hands trembled when she tried to thread a needle already made peace with the reading glasses that now hung on a chain around her neck. The hearing could wait a little longer. Behind her, unnoticed in her rearview mirror, a patrol car had fallen into position 3 car lengths back. Officer Ryan Beckett, 28 years old and 8 years on the force, had been running radar when he spotted the old Camry puttering along well under the speed limit. It wasn't illegal, not technically, but it irritated him. Sunday mornings were usually quiet, which meant they were boring, and Beckett didn't handle boredom well. He had a pattern, one that would later be documented in excruciating detail during the internal affairs investigation, of finding reasons to make stops when his shift dragged. The elderly driver ahead of him creeping along, like she had all the time in the world, struck him as the perfect opportunity to break up the monotony. He tapped his horn. It's a short burst meant to encourage her to either speed up or pull over. Martha didn't react. She continued her steady pace, her eyes focused on the road ahead, her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, exactly as she had been taught in driver's education back in 1964. The birds were singing in the oak trees that lined the street, their morning chorus audible, even through her closed windows. She was thinking about the sermon she would hear about the potluck lunch afterward, where she had promised to bring her famous sweet potato pie, about whether her grandson would remember to call her that evening, like he usually did on Sundays. Beckett's jaw tightened. He laid on the horn again longer this time, the blaring sound shattering the peaceful morning. Still nothing. The old woman just kept driving, apparently oblivious to the patrol car behind her with its insistent horn. His irritation flared into genuine anger. Was she deaf, senile, deliberately ignoring him? He didn't consider that it might be any combination of those factors, didn't pause to think about why an elderly woman driving to church on a Sunday morning might not be a threat requiring aggressive intervention. Instead, he made a decision that would alter both their lives irrevocably. He hit his lights and sirened the sudden wail of the patrol car cutting through the morning like a knife. He accelerated, pulling into the opposite lane and racing past the Camry before swerving sharply in front of it, forcing Martha to brake suddenly. Her body lurched forward against the seatbelt, her heart hammering in her chest, as her car came to an abrupt stop just inches from his rear bumper. The peaceful Sunday morning evaporated in an instant, replaced by flashing lights and the aggressive posture of a young officer already out of his vehicle and striding towards her with his hand on a service weapon. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Through her windshield, Martha could see his face red with anger, his mouth already moving in what she assumed were shouted commands she couldn't quite hear. Her hands were shaking, now not from age, but from the adrenaline flooding her system. She had presided over thousands of cases during her 4.5 decades on the federal bench, had sentenced murderers and drug kingpins and corrupt officials, had maintained her composure through death threats and protests in endless trials that tested every ounce of her judicial temperament. But in that moment, sitting in her old car, with a furious young police officer bearing down on her, she felt suddenly, terrifyingly vulnerable. Beckett reached her door and hammered on the window with his fist, the impact making her flinch. She fumbled for the window control, her arthritic fingers struggling with the button as she tried to comply with what she understood was a command to open it. When the window finally descended, his voice hit her like a physical force. License and registration. Now. There was no greeting, no explanation, just the bark of authority wielded without restraint. Martha's voice came out smaller than she intended, the words careful and respectful, in the way she had been taught to address authority figures during her childhood in the segregated South. "Officer, I was simply driving to church. Is there a problem?" His response dripped with contempt as he leaned down to look inside her car, his eyes scanning the interior with obvious suspicion. "Yeah, there's a problem. You were obstructing traffic, driving like you own the road. This car, where'd someone like you get a car like this? Don't tell me it's yours." The implication hung in the air between them, ugly and unmistakable. Martha had heard variations of that tone. Her entire life had fought against those assumptions through law school, in the prosecutor's office, and private practice, and finally onto the federal bench, where she had spent decades proving that someone like her belonged exactly where she was. She reached for her purse, slowly aware that sudden movements around police officers could be dangerous, especially for someone who looked like her. Her fingers found her wallet and extracted her driver's license, along with the small leather case that held her federal credentials. "I am Federal Judge Martha Higgins," she said quietly, holding the identification out to him with a steady hand despite the trembling in her chest. "I've served on the bench for 45 years. This is indeed my vehicle, and I was driving within the legal speed limit." What happened next would be replayed in courtrooms and news broadcasts for months to come. Beckett snatched the identification from her hand, barely glancing at the credentials that identified her as a lifetime appointee to the federal judiciary, one of the most powerful positions in the American legal system. Instead, he let out a harsh, mocking laugh that made her stomach drop. "Federal Judge Wright, and I'm the president. Nice try, Grandma. People like you always got some story." He stepped back from the car, and his voice rose to a shout. "Step out of the vehicle. You're being detained for suspicious activity and resisting an officer." Martha's mind raced. She hadn't resisted anything. She had been cooperative, respectful, had provided her identification exactly as requested. But she had also been a judge long enough to know that arguing with a police officer during a traffic stop was futile and potentially dangerous. She reached for her seatbelt with trembling fingers and released it, then pushed open the car door and began the slow process of extracting her 75-year-old body from the driver's seat. Her knees protested stiff from the drive, and she had to use the doorframe to steady herself as she stood. "Officer, please." She tried, again her voice carrying the measured tone she had used in countless courtrooms. "I am Judge Martha Higgins. If you would simply verify my credentials." "Yeah, right, Grandma. Judge, nice try." Beckett cut her off, moving behind her with sudden aggression. Before she could process what was happening, he grabbed her wrist and twisted her arm behind her back. The movement was violent, practiced the kind of maneuver designed for suspects half her age and twice her strength. Martha cried out as her shoulders screamed in protest, the joint straining in ways it was never meant to move. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed in her ears, impossibly loud, followed by a sickening crunch from somewhere in her wrist as the metal bit into her skin and bone. "You're hurting me," she gasped, the words coming out in a pained wheeze. "You're breaking my arm." Her medical credentials, which had been clutched in her other hand, tumbled from her fingers and fell to the pavement, the leather case landing face up with her official photograph and the sill of the federal judiciary clearly visible. Beckett didn't even look down. "Quick question for you. Watching, if you were driving past this scene right now, would you stop to record it? Or would you keep going, not wanting to get involved?" Type your honest answer in the comments. Because what happens next proves that witnesses with cameras can change everything. The body cam footage, later enhanced and analyzed frame by forensic video experts, captured the exact moment when Martha Higgins's composure finally cracked. As Beckett forced her toward his patrol car, with her arms wrenched behind her back, her breathing became labored, shallow gasps that spoke of pain and fear and a lifetime of indignities she had thought were finally behind her. She tried to turn her head to make eye contact with him, to find some shred of humanity in this young man who was treating her like a criminal. "Please," she said again. And the word carried the weight of 7 decades of experience, of battles fought and one of dignity, maintained through circumstances that would have broken lesser people. "I am not resisting. I am a federal judge. My identification is right there on the ground." Beckett's response was to press his hand against the top of her head and push her down toward the back seat of his patrol car, the standard technique for loading a suspect, but applied with unnecessary force to a woman who posed no physical threat whatsoever. Martha's silver hair, so carefully styled that morning, caught on the doorframe and came loose from its pins. She felt tears prick at her eyes, not from physical pain, but from the sheer humiliation of it all. She had sentenced men to death, had written legal opinions that shaped civil rights law, had been honored by 3 presidents, and now she was being shoved into the back of a police car like a common criminal. Her wrists bound her dignity, stripped away on a Sunday morning while the church bells rang in the distance. Across the street, Eleanor Davis was returning from the grocery store when she spotted the commotion. She had lived in the neighborhood for 16 years and knew Judge Higgins by sight, had served on a jury in her courtroom once, and never forgot the experience. What she saw made her blood run cold. She pulled her phone from her purse and started recording, her hands shaking so badly that the footage would later require stabilization software to be fully usable. But she kept filming, kept that camera pointed at the patrol car, because some part of her understood that what she was witnessing needed to be documented. Within minutes, James Mitchell, who lived 3 doors down from the judge, came running from his yard. He had seen the flashing lights and had that sinking feeling that something was very wrong. When he recognized Martha Higgins's silver hair visible through the patrol car window, he didn't hesitate. "Officer," he called out, jogging toward Beckett with his hands raised to show he meant no threat. "Officer, that's Judge Higgins, federal judge Martha Higgins. You've made a mistake." Beckett spun around, his face still flushed with anger, his hand dropping instinctively to his weapon. "Back off or I arrest you too. This is an active police matter. Step back now." Mitchell held his ground, though he raised his hands higher, his voice urgent but controlled. "Sir, I'm trying to help you avoid a massive problem. That woman in your car is a federal judge. She's lived in this neighborhood for 20 years. I'm telling you, you need to verify her identity right now." But Beckett wasn't listening. He advanced on Mitchell, his body language aggressive, his voice rising. I said back off. You're interfering with the police investigation. Get back or you're going in cuffs too. It was only then as he turned back toward his patrol car that Beckett's foot came down on something on the pavement. He looked down and saw the leather credential case now scuffed from being stepped on lying open on the ground. He bent down and picked it up, irritation still written across his features, ready to dismiss it as some kind of fake identification that criminals probably bought online these days. But as his eyes focused on the official seal, the photograph, the signature of the Chief Judge of the United States, his expression began to change. The flush of anger drained from his face, replaced by a pallor that made him look suddenly ill. Behind him, the sound of additional sirens grew louder as backup units that he had called for approached the scene. Eleanor Davis kept recording her phone, now held steady as she documented every moment. In the back of the patrol car, Judge Martha Higgins sat with her head bowed, her wrists screaming in pain from the too tight handcuffs, her mind already cataloging every violation of her constitutional rights, every failure of procedure, every word that would later become evidence in a federal lawsuit that would cost Officer Ryan Beckett everything he had worked for and more than he could ever imagine. Officer Ryan Beckett stood frozen on the pavement, the leather credential case trembling in his hands. The photograph stared back at him with the same calm, dignified expression he had just seen twisted in pain moments ago. Federal Judge Martha Higgins, appointed for life. Northern District. The official seal gleamed under the morning sun, authentic and undeniable. His throat went dry as his eyes moved across the text, reading and rereading the same words as if repetition might somehow change their meaning. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of elaborate fake. People didn't just drive around with federal judge credentials. Certainly not elderly black women in beat-up sedans going to church on Sunday morning. But even as his mind scrambled for alternative explanations, some deeper instinct was already screaming at him that he had made a catastrophic error. His hand moved to his radio with mechanical precision, muscle memory, taking over where rational thought had fled. He pressed the button, his voice coming out hoarse and uncertain in a way that would have been unthinkable just 10 minutes earlier. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. I need you to run a verification on a name. Martha Higgins, that's Higgins, claiming to be federal judiciary. He tried to keep his voice steady, professional, but there was an unmistakable tremor beneath the words. In the background, James Mitchell stood with his arms still raised, watching with an expression that mixed vindication with genuine concern. Eleanor Davis continued recording her phone, now capturing Beckett's face as the color drained from it, degree by degree. The radio crackled with static, the sound abnormally loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the street. Birds had stopped singing. Traffic seemed to have evaporated. Even the wind appeared to be holding its breath. Beckett waited each second, stretching into an eternity, his mind replaying the last 15 minutes in excruciating detail. The way he had grabbed her arm, the sound she had made when the handcuffs clicked shut, the leather case falling to the ground, his boot coming down on it. Every moment now recontextualized, transformed from routine police work into something that made his stomach turn. Inside the patrol car, Judge Higgins sat perfectly still, her breathing controlled despite the pain radiating from her wrists. She had been in enough courtrooms to recognize the exact moment when someone realized they had lost. She had seen it in the faces of defendants when the verdict came back guilty, in the expressions of attorneys when she ruled against them, on a critical motion in the eyes of witnesses when their lies were exposed under cross-examination. She was seeing it now in Officer Beckett's face through the reinforced glass that separated them, and she felt no satisfaction in it. Only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and the cold certainty that what came next was inevitable. The radio erupted with sound that shattered the silence like breaking glass. The dispatcher's voice came through with an urgency that made everyone within earshot snap to attention. Unit 7, Code Red, repeat. Code Red. Subject is confirmed as Federal Judge Martha Elizabeth Higgins. Northern District, lifetime appointee, release immediately. Supervisor has been notified and is en route. Unit 7 acknowledge. The words hit Beckett like physical blows. His knees actually buckled slightly, and he had to lock them to keep from staggering. His free hand came up to his face, covering his mouth as the full magnitude of what he had done crashed over him in waves. He had arrested a federal judge. He had physically restrained her, injured her, dismissed her repeated attempts to identify herself, ignored witnesses who tried to correct him, and thrown her in the back of his car like a common criminal. The credentials in his hands suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Unit 7 acknowledging. He managed to croak into the radio, the words barely audible. His hands were shaking so badly now that he nearly dropped the credential case as he moved toward the patrol car. Behind him, Mitchell lowered his arms slowly, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to pity. Davis kept her camera trained on the scene, understanding instinctively that these next few minutes would be crucial evidence in whatever legal proceedings followed. Beckett opened the rear door of the patrol car with hands that wouldn't stay steady. Judge Higgins turned her head slowly to look at him, and the expression in her eyes made him want to disappear into the pavement. There was no anger there, no satisfaction at being proven right, just a cold, analytical assessment that felt more damning than any rage could have been. She was already building her case, he realized with sickening clarity. Every detail was being cataloged, every violation documented in the courtroom of her mind. "Ma'am, I need to remove the restraints," he said, his voice stripped of all the authority and aggression it had carried just minutes before. She didn't respond, simply turned her back toward him to give him access to the handcuffs. Her silence was more eloquent than any accusation. As he fumbled with the key, his fingers struggling to fit it into the mechanism, he could see the damage he had caused. Her wrists were already beginning to bruise, dark marks blooming against her brown skin where the metal had bit too deep. When the cuffs finally clicked open, she brought her hands forward, slowly cradling her right wrist with her left hand, as she examined the injury with the detached interest of someone assessing evidence. She didn't rub her wrists the way most people did when cuffs came off. Instead, she held them up slightly, angling them so that the marks were clearly visible to Eleanor Davis's camera, to the backup units now pulling up to the scene, to the body cam still recording on Beckett's chest. She was thinking like a prosecutor now, like the attorney she had been before ascending to the bench building. Her case with every gesture and every moment of documented pain. Sergeant William Torres arrived on scene with his lights flashing, but no siren, clearly trying to minimize the spectacle, even though it was far too late for that. He emerged from his vehicle, already knowing he was walking into a career-defining disaster, his face set in grim lines as he took in the tableau before him. An elderly black woman sitting in the back of a patrol car with visible injuries. A young officer who looked like he might vomit at any moment. Neighbors with phones out recording everything. And somewhere in the mix, allegedly a federal judge whose constitutional rights had been violated in ways that would make civil rights attorneys salivate. Torres approached the patrol car with his hands visible, his voice gentle in the way of someone trying to de-escalate a situation that was already far beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. "Judge Higgins, I'm Sergeant Torres. I want to apologize on behalf of the entire department. This should never have happened. If you need medical attention, I need my credentials returned." Judge Higgins interrupted, her voice cutting through his rehearsed apology with surgical precision. "I need the badge numbers of every officer on scene. I need the names of all witnesses documented. And I need you to understand, Sergeant, that I will not be accepting any apologies, informal resolutions, or suggestions that this matter can be handled internally." She stepped carefully out of the patrol car, steadying herself with one hand on the doorframe, her injured wrist held protectively against her chest. Torres extended his hand in what was meant to be a conciliatory gesture, a physical symbol of respect and regret. Judge Higgins looked at his outstretched hand with the same expression she might give a piece of tainted evidence in her courtroom, then deliberately turned away without acknowledging it. The rejection was absolute, unmistakable, and witnessed by everyone present. Torres' hand fell back to his side, his face flushing with embarrassment, and the dawning realization that standard damage control procedures were not going to work here. "I want to be absolutely clear about something," Judge Higgins said, her voice carrying across the street with the same authority she wielded from the bench. She was standing now at her full height despite the pain, despite the exhaustion, despite the trembling that she refused to let show in her voice. "I have served in the federal judiciary for 45 years. In that time, I have presided over thousands of cases. I have sentenced 47 individuals to death for crimes so heinous they forfeited their right to live in civilized society. I have never taken those responsibilities lightly, and I have never issued a sentence without being absolutely certain of both guilt and proportionality." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over everyone present. Beckett stood frozen several feet away, his face the color of old paste, unable to meet her eyes. Torres shifted uncomfortably, already mentally composing the incident report that would end careers and possibly bring federal oversight to their entire department. The neighbors watched in silence, witnesses to something that transcended a simple traffic stop and had become a moment of reckoning. "I am going to bring that same level of certainty and attention to detail to what happens next." Judge Higgins continued, her eyes moving deliberately from Beckett to Torres to the patrol car with its still running camera. "When I issue my judgment on this matter, you can be assured that it will be thorough, well-documented, and absolutely devastating. Not because I am vindictive, but because the law demands it and justice requires it." She walked slowly to where her credentials lay on the ground, bent carefully to retrieve them, and brushed off the dirt with her uninjured hand. The leather case showed scuff marks from where Beckett's boot had landed on it, physical evidence that would later be photographed and entered into evidence as Exhibit C in her federal lawsuit. She looked at the case for a long moment, then placed it carefully back in her vest pocket, the gesture somehow imbued with finality. A taxi called by Eleanor Davis during the confrontation pulled up to the curb. Judge Higgins turned toward it without another word to the officers, moving with careful dignity despite her injuries. She paused only to exchange a few quiet words with Davis, who nodded vigorously and promised to send the video footage immediately. Mitchell stepped forward to offer his arm for support, which she accepted with a small nod of thanks. Together they walked to the taxi, and as she lowered herself into the back seat, she turned one last time to look at the scene she was leaving behind. Beckett stood like a statue in the middle of the street, still holding the now empty handcuffs. Torres was already on his radio, his voice tight as he called for internal affairs and began the process that would dissect every second of this encounter. Patrol cars sat with their lights still flashing, illuminating the morning in alternating red and blue. And through it all, the church bells continued to ring in the distance, calling the faithful to worship, indifferent to the disaster that had unfolded on this quiet Sunday morning. The taxi door closed with a solid thunk that seemed to echo down the entire street, a sound of finality that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Through the window, Judge Higgins could be seen carefully adjusting her vest, straightening her collar, composing herself for the church service. She was still determined to attend despite everything. Her face was set in an expression of calm resolve that her family and colleagues would have recognized immediately. It was the look she wore when preparing to issue a particularly significant ruling, the face of justice about to be dispensed without mercy or hesitation. As the taxi pulled away from the curb and disappeared around the corner, heading toward First Baptist Church, where the congregation was beginning to gather, Sergeant Torres turned to face Officer Beckett. No words were necessary. They both knew what was coming: the investigation, the suspension, the lawsuit. The end of a career that had just self-destructed in spectacular fashion on a quiet Sunday morning, all because a young officer couldn't imagine that someone who looked like Judge Martha Higgins could possibly be exactly who she said she was. 3 days later, Chief Rebecca Morrison sat in her office with the lights dimmed, the dashboard camera footage playing on her computer screen for the fourth time. Each viewing made it worse. She could hear every word, see every gesture, watch in real time as one of her officers destroyed not just his own career, but potentially the reputation of the entire department. When Beckett's voice came through the speakers saying, "Federal Judge Wright, and I'm the president. Nice try, Grandma." Morrison closed her eyes and pressed her palms against her temples. The headache that had been building since Sunday evening, when she first received the call about the incident, had now become a constant throbbing presence. She paused the video at the moment when Judge Higgins' credential case fell to the ground, the federal seal clearly visible even in the footage. Morrison had been in law enforcement for 26 years, had worked her way up from patrol officer to chief through a combination of competence, political savvy, and an ability to navigate the increasingly complex relationship between police departments and the communities they served. She had survived budget cuts, corruption scandals, and 3 different mayors, each with their own vision for public safety. But this was different. This was a federal judge with video evidence of constitutional violations so clear-cut that her department's legal counsel had actually laughed a bitter, hopeless laugh when he first reviewed the footage. Morrison opened Beckett's personnel file, spreading the contents across her desk like a coroner laying out evidence at an autopsy. What she saw made her stomach turn. 9 formal complaints over 8 years. 9. Every single one involved allegations of excessive force, unprofessional conduct, or discriminatory behavior toward elderly citizens or people of color. Mrs. Chen, age 68, complained that Beckett had been unnecessarily rough and disrespectful during a minor traffic violation. Mr. Washington, a black businessman, filed a complaint alleging racial profiling after being stopped 3 times in 6 months while driving through his own neighborhood. An elderly white man named Harold Stevens reported that Beckett had shouted at him and threatened him with arrest when Stevens moved too slowly while retrieving his license. The pattern was unmistakable, undeniable, and completely unaddressed. Each complaint had been investigated, sure, but the investigations were perfunctory at best. Beckett would claim he was just doing his job. His supervisor would note that policing was stressful work. The complainant would be offered an apology. The file would be closed. No disciplinary action beyond a written warning or mandatory retraining that clearly had no effect. Morrison had seen this pattern before in other officers' files, had promised herself and the community that she would address it, and somehow it had still slipped through the cracks until it exploded in the worst possible way. She pulled up the statistical analysis that her Internal Affairs Division had prepared at her request. The numbers were damning. Over the past 3 years, Beckett had initiated 247 traffic stops. Of those 156, more than 60% involved drivers who were either elderly or people of color, despite the fact that his patrol zone was predominantly young and white. His searches of black drivers were conducted at a rate 4 times higher than his searches of white drivers. Yet his contraband discovery rate was actually lower for black drivers, proving that his suspicions were based on bias rather than legitimate law enforcement instinct. Morrison picked up her phone and called the city attorney. "It's indefensible," she said without preamble when he answered. "I'm terminating him today. I need you to prepare for the lawsuit because it's coming and we're going to lose." The termination hearing took place in a windowless conference room with Beckett, his union representative, the city attorney, and Morrison herself. Beckett sat with his shoulders hunched, his face gray, looking like he had aged 10 years in 3 days. His union rep tried to argue for suspension instead of termination, citing Beckett's years of service and the lack of prior severe disciplinary action. Morrison cut him off. "Officer Beckett arrested a federal judge in her own driveway, injured her while doing so, ignored multiple attempts by the judge herself and witnesses to correct his error, and created a civil rights violation so egregious that it will cost the city millions of dollars and years of credibility in the community. There is no path forward that includes him wearing this badge." She slid the termination paperwork across the table. "Sign it or don't, but you're done here either way." Beckett signed. His hand shook so badly he could barely hold the pen, and his signature was almost illegible, but he signed. When he stood to leave, he looked at Morrison with red-rimmed eyes and opened his mouth as if to say something, then seemed to think better of it. What was there to say? That he was sorry? That he didn't mean it? That he was just having a bad day? None of it mattered anymore. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt more final than if he had slammed it. The local newspaper ran the story the next day with the headline, "Police Chief Fires Officer Who Arrested Federal Judge." Within hours, it had been picked up by regional news, then national outlets, then international media. The video footage released through a public records request filed by Judge Higgins' attorneys went viral. Legal analysts on cable news dissected every frame, every word, every moment of the encounter. Civil rights organizations called for federal investigations. The Department of Justice announced they would be reviewing the department's policies and practices regarding racial profiling. The mayor held a press conference promising reforms that should have been implemented years ago. 18 months later, the federal courthouse was packed for the final day of trial. Judge Higgins had recused herself from presiding, of course, and the case had been assigned to Judge Thomas Crawford, a colleague who had served alongside her for 2 decades. The jury had heard 5 days of testimony, had seen the dashboard camera footage, had listened to expert witnesses, explained the constitutional violations, had reviewed Beckett's personnel file in excruciating detail. They had heard from Eleanor Davis and James Mitchell, who described what they witnessed. They had seen photographs of Judge Higgins' bruised wrists, her medical records documenting the sprained wrist that required months of physical therapy. They had heard the police dispatcher's panicked voice shouting, "Code Red," over the radio. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous: $900,000 in compensatory and punitive damages. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom, a sound that represented not just the end of this particular case, but a broader statement about accountability and justice. Judge Higgins sat in the plaintiff's gallery, her hands folded in her lap, her expression neutral. When the verdict was read, she allowed herself the smallest nod of acknowledgement before rising to leave. She made no statement to the press gathered outside, no victory speeches, no moments of triumph. She simply walked to her car and drove home where she had work to do. 6 months after the verdict, the Martha Higgins Foundation for Elder Justice was officially established with a mission to provide legal assistance to elderly citizens who experience police misconduct or age-based discrimination. The foundation offered free legal representation, public education programs, and advocacy for policy reforms. Judge Higgins, now officially retired from the bench, threw herself into the work with the same intensity she had brought to her judicial duties. She had turned her trauma into purpose, her pain into protection for others who might not have her resources or her knowledge of the legal system. But even as the foundation grew and began changing lives, even as policies were reformed and officers were retrained, a question lingered in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Judge Martha Higgins had the credentials, the knowledge, the resources, and the credibility to fight back against what happened to her. She had witnesses with cameras. She had colleagues who could testify to her character. She had the legal expertise to build an airtight case. Her lawsuit succeeded because of who she was and what she represented. But what about all the others? What about the elderly citizens who were treated roughly by impatient officers and had no recourse? Because there was no video, no witnesses, no credentials that commanded automatic respect. What about the people who looked like Judge Higgins but didn't have her education or her connections or her platform? How many Sunday mornings had been ruined? How many dignities had been stripped away? How many constitutional violations had occurred in the shadows, where cameras didn't reach and justice couldn't follow? The truth was uncomfortable and unavoidable. Justice had been served in this case, but it had been served because the victim was someone the system couldn't ignore. The dash cam footage proved what happened, but it took a federal judge being arrested in her own driveway to force the system to actually look at that footage and care about what it showed. The question wasn't whether Judge Higgins deserved justice. She absolutely did. The question was whether justice should depend on who you are rather than on what happened to you. Officer Ryan Beckett never worked in law enforcement again. He took a job in warehouse logistics, moved to a different state, and tried to rebuild a life from the ruins of his old one. The $900,000 judgment was paid by the city's insurance, but his name was forever attached to one of the most high-profile cases of police misconduct in recent memory. Sometimes late at night he would think about that Sunday morning and wonder what would have happened if he had just let the old woman drive to church in peace. But wondering changed nothing. The damage was done, recorded, and permanent. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a situation where someone's age or appearance led to them being treated unfairly by authority figures? Share your story, and in the comments, your experience might help someone else understand how to handle these situations better or recognize when they're happening. And if you want to see more cases where justice finally caught up with those who thought they were above accountability, hit that follow button, because we're just getting started on exposing how the system really works and how it can be forced to work the way it should.